His guilt or innocence is not in question. Theodore Harrison Jr. pled guilty to the 1988 execution-style murders of Renee Krall Hollings and Brian Scott Stevenson in 1990 and has been in prison since. On Monday, Harrison was back in the Chester County Courthouse for a resentencing. Harrison and his co-defendant Robert Moore, who was slated for a resentencing in March, were 16 when they stole the vehicles of Rawlings and Stevenson, then shot the two in the head in a wooded area near Richburg. They were each sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 25 years. However, per the 2012 Miller v. Alabama Supreme Court decision, juveniles sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole are now entitled to a new sentencing.
Your Honor, these cases came back from the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, after hearing a lot of evidence from a bunch of scientists who had done a lot of research on psychology on juveniles, determined that kids are just different and we have to treat them differently for sentencing purposes. And they recognize that children do horrible things sometimes and that they have been sentenced to life without parole in many cases all across the United States, but that the characteristics of youth, for instance, heedless risk-taking, being subject to peer pressure and unable to control their emotions. These things had not been taken into consideration sufficiently when they were sentenced. And Mr. Harrison basically got a couple of sentences about who he was as a person at the time that his case was decided. We're going to introduce evidence about who he is, what he's been through beforehand, what he's been through since. And the issue really comes down to whether or not he's what we would call incorrigible. And the Supreme Court has said that it should be very rare that a juvenile should be given a life without parole sentence, and that it should only be in cases where it's determined that the state has met its burden of proving that the defendant is permanently incorrigible, incapable of being rehabilitated.
Expert defense witness Dr. Joey Garbarino, a developmental psychologist, testified that the human brain does not fully mature until age 26, and said Harrison at 16 did not understand risks and consequences for his actions. He said Harrison's father being absent from the home, his mother frequently working, and Harrison's early abuse of alcohol and marijuana left him susceptible to peer influence from someone like Moore, who he said exhibited antisocial behavior. He called Harrison, quote, resilient, and noted that he had educated himself on legal matters to the point that, quote, more than one law firm is offering to hire him if he is released. The state challenged his opinion, particularly as it related to Moore.
And so I want to make sure that you and I are on the same page regarding this. Okay, I'm going to look at page 11, sir. First of all, you indicate that Robert Moore has a history of antisocial behavior. Did you talk to Mr. Moore?
No.
Did you get his records?
No, I saw reference, I was given materials that made reference to others' reports.
Okay.
It is just,
I got you. All righty, and so you've never looked into the psychological mind of Mr. Moore and his youthfulness during this period of time, is that correct?
no.
On the night of February 8, 1988, the two victims were sitting in their cars next to a car wash on Lancaster Street. Harrison and Moore were in Chester from their home in Fairfield. Both were armed, and the two wanted to steal a car to drive to Florida. With guns drawn, they forced the two to drive them in Rawlings's car 10.9 miles down Highway 9 towards Richburg.
They were in the back seats behind the victims, guns on the victims.
When they approach the cars, where's everybody at?
Rollins is under the steering wheel for a car.
Z24.
Yes, Cavalier.
So where's the Z28?
Parked right side.
Okay.
Parked side by side.
So Ms. Rollins and Mr. Stevenson both in the car.
Stevenson got out of his car and got in for a car. They were approached by the defendants, guns drawn from the car. The defendants get in the back seat. Please, Mr. Harrison is on the passenger side and Mr. Moore was on the driver's side. Anyway, they forced them to pull away. They drove out number 9.
They're holding that gun.
Holding them at gunpoint. They drove spot, a dark spot. They pulled off there. Mr. Moore said Mr. Harrison took him out of the car and walked him into the woods.
He also described,
And as he was walking him into the woods, she was begging for her life. Please don't kill us.
he was crying, please don't kill him,
Please don't kill us.
begging for life.
Stevenson was shot twice in the head, Rawlings once. Their bodies were left where they were shot. Moore and Harrison then drove back to Chester, got Stevenson's car, drove home to dump items from the vehicles in a dumpster, then presumably headed for Florida before wrecking the cars in Columbia. For 6 weeks, Rawlings and Stevenson were considered missing persons. In March, their bodies were found by a family looking for aluminum cans on the side of the road.
Two deceased bodies laying right next to each other. Appeared to be fully clothed, but they had been there in some appearances for quite some time.
Were you immediately able to identify a body? Or anybody?
I won't say I'm easily identified. We felt like we knew who it was. I wasn't gonna make a call until.
You had a description of the clothes these folks were wearing when they left.
Yes, we did, and it appeared to be the same clothes they were wearing that night.
A few months later, the two executed a pair of burglaries, stealing money, a cassette player, and a gun from some homes in the Simpson community, then went to Columbia where they executed a carjacking in a Kroger parking lot, holding Lynetta Brawley and Andre Chavis at gunpoint and briefly kidnapping them. Former Richland County Investigator David Bell read a statement Harrison gave about the incident.
Say.
So we pulled her behind the Volvo,
Yes, sir.
and Robert, he jumped out and asked him, where's the car at tonight? And the fellow, he stands up and say, he don't know, and he looks down at the girl and asked the girl, she said she don't know. So I jumped out with the 20 gauge shotgun and told him to sit on the curb and be quiet. I get around where they at, and I tell them to get in the car. So Robert peed around on the passenger side to keep them, drawing attention to anything like that. I told Robert to hold on the rifle until I get in the back on the other side, to keep taking it around back on the other side, to keep it taking around the other side so the public can see it. So he handed it to me, talked it at one time, showed him something, so he handed it to me, and I got it and sitting in the back. I got the back end of the barrel, and the muzzle sitting back this way, and I got the barrel pointing at the fellow in the back.
Okay, that's it.
Brawley and Chavis managed to escape as Harrison and Moore stopped for gas. The two juveniles were arrested the next day on the New Jersey Turnpike. They were actually serving 30-year sentences for that incident when one of them began talking in jail about the Chester murders. Soon they were charged in the death of Stevenson and Rawlings, for which they struck a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In 1995, Harrison was involved in what was called the longest prison riot in state history. He was alleged to have attacked an officer and held a female employee at Broad River Correctional Institute by the throat while threatening her with a bat. Colonel James Cooper with the Department of Corrections said in court Monday that Harrison stabbed him with a shank during that riot. Harrison spent 20 years in solitary confinement as a result, though he was never officially convicted for his role in the riot. Garbarino indicated that the long stint in solitary confinement was the starting point for many mental problems for Harrison, including major depression and schizoaffective disorder. The trial is slated to continue on Friday.